last week, we looked at evidence for God's existence. So we are establishing an apologetic for Christianity, and it's a two-step approach. So last week we looked at 3 arguments for God's existence. Yesterday, the credit students went through the evidence for Jesus' existence. We also gave 10 facts about Jesus that all scholars agree to, and we showed that those 10 facts provide adequate inductive grounds for inferring the resurrection. Beyond the evidence for Jesus' existence, just by quoting authorities, we looked at the ancient evidence for Jesus' existence in non-New Testament literature, and we cited close to 10 ancient historians who referred to Jesus. And there's a lot you can know about Jesus before you even open the New Testament. And then we looked at the evidence for Jesus from Paul, and we looked at 4 epistles of Paul that scholars call the chief letters of Paul. They are 4: Romans, Galatians, and the Corinthian correspondence. Most scholars will go beyond that and say that Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians and Philemon and Philippians. But then all the other books of Paul are debated. When I do apologetics, I really just hang out in the Haftabrepha, the 4 epistles that Paul wrote and that we know he wrote, when I know no skeptic is going to question. But at the very end, I gave a case for Paul's authorship of those epistles. For those of you that missed that, the videos will be going up relatively soon. So what are we going to do today? Today, we're going to ask the question and try to answer it. Do we have the New Testament that was written in the first century? So we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at evidence for the New Testament as a whole. On Saturday, we are going to look at the evidence that the apostles actually wrote the 4 Gospels. But here we're going to be looking at the preservation of the New Testament documents. Now, how many of you have heard this statement? Some of you may have said this statement, and the statement goes something like this: I can't believe the Bible because the Bible is a translation of a translation of a translation. How many of you heard something like that? Okay. I have a bunch of Bibles on my desk here, and this Bible right here is a translation of a translation of a translation. This is the Douay-Rheims Bible. It was produced at the end of the 16th century when it was just a foregone conclusion that English-speaking Christians were going to have access to the Bible in their own language. The Catholic Church produced this Bible. This Bible is a translation of this Bible. This is the Latin Vulgate. This was produced by Jerome around the year 400. It is a Latin translation of the Scriptures. It is a translation of this. This is a Hebrew and Greek Bible. So the Douay-Rheims literally is a translation of a translation of a translation. But your English Bibles, for the most part, are not that. Your English Bibles, like right here, I have an English Standard Version. It is a translation of the original Hebrew or Greek scriptures. So it is just not true to say that the typical Bible that most Christians read is a translation of a translation of a translation. I can give you an example of a translation of a translation of a translation, but this is not that. This is just a translation. So that really isn't the question that most people have in mind when they say the Bible is a translation of a translation of a translation. What they really have in mind is, do we now possess, for example, the Greek New Testament that was actually produced in the first century? Has the text been well preserved over time? And if so, how do we know? Well, I'm going to take you, this is something I've written here, I'm going to take you through a couple of arguments that Bart Ehrman has given as to why we shouldn't think that the New Testament has been well preserved, and we're going to look at some answers to them. So there are 3 arguments against the integrity of the New Testament text. First, there's the problem of the lack of the original autographs. So some people will say, and they will be right when they say it, we don't have the original autographs of the New Testament. So for example, when Paul sat down to write Galatians, he probably didn't write it anyway. He probably dictated it to somebody, but let's just imagine for the sake of discussion that Paul sat down and wrote Galatians. That parchment that he wrote on, we don't have. It's gone. What we have are copies. I know some Christians that freak out over that one fact. The second argument against the integrity of the New Testament text is that we have a lot of differences or variants between those manuscripts, those copies of the New Testament. And then finally, there's an attack on the church itself as a custodian of the scriptures. So what are the three arguments? Lack of original autographs, multiple differences or variants between the manuscripts, and then thirdly, the church was not an adequate custodian of the scriptures. So here is a quotation by Bart Ehrman. This is what Ehrman says. I'm going to start by giving an illustration of one of the books of the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark. Mark is our oldest gospel. Many scholars think that Mark was the first gospel to be written. We don't know where Mark was actually written. Scholars have different hypotheses about where it was written. Many scholars over the years have thought that maybe Mark was written in the city of Rome. Fair enough. Let's say that the Gospel of Mark was written in the city of Rome. Somebody, we call him Mark because we don't know his name, and it doesn't make sense to call him Fred. Some dude named Mark or Fred or whoever this guy was, he sat down and wrote a gospel. How did this gospel get put in circulation? Well, it wasn't like it is today. Today, when an author writes a book, the book gets run off by electronic means and gets composed and produced and distributed so that you can pick up a copy of any book, like the Da Vinci Code, in a bookstore in New Orleans, and another in California, and another in New York, and it's going to be exactly the same book. Every word will be exactly the same because of our ways of producing books. But they didn't have these means of producing books in the ancient world. The only way to produce a book in the ancient world was to copy it by hand. One page, one sentence, one word, one letter at a time by hand. Mass producing books in the ancient world meant some guy standing up in front dictating and three others writing down what he said. That was mass production, producing books three at a time. What happens when books are copied by hand? Try it sometime and you'll find out what happens. People make mistakes. By the way, I never make mistakes, but some people make them. Yesterday, I quoted somebody and I had a typo. So I am an illustration of that very point. People make mistakes when they copy books. Sometimes my students are not convinced of this. So I tell them, go home and copy the Gospel of Matthew and see how well you do. They're going to make mistakes. So Mark's book gets copied by somebody in Rome who wants a copy. They don't want just one copy. They want another copy. So somebody makes a copy and probably the person makes some mistakes and then somebody copies the copy. Now, when you copy the copy, you don't know the guy who copied it ahead of you made mistakes. You assume he got it right. So when you copy his copy, you reproduce his mistakes and you introduce your own mistakes. And then the third person comes along and copies the copy that you've made of a copy and reproduces the mistake that you made and that your predecessor made, and he makes his own mistakes. And so it goes. Somebody eventually visits the city of Rome, somebody from Ephesus say, and decides, we want a copy of that. So he copies one of the copies. But he's copying a copy that has mistakes in it, and he takes it back to Ephesus, and there in Ephesus, somebody copies it, and then somebody in Smyrna shows up and decides they want a copy. Well, they copy the copy of the copy of the copy, and then somebody decides they want a copy in Antioch. And so they come and make a copy. Copies get made and reproduced, and as a result, you get copies not just of the original, but copies of the copies of the copies of the original. The only time mistakes get corrected is when somebody is copying a manuscript and they think that the copy they're copying has a mistake in it, and they try to correct the mistake. So they change the wording in order to make it correct. The problem is there's no way to know whether somebody who's correcting a mistake has corrected it correctly. It's possible that the person who saw there was a mistake and tried to correct it, but corrected it incorrectly, which means that you've got three states of the text: the original text, the mistake, and the mistaken correction of the mistake. And then somebody copies that copy, and so it goes on basically for year after year. Mistakes get made en route. Mistakes get copied and recopied. Mistakes get corrected, but sometimes incorrectly, and so it goes. Now, if we had the original copy of Mark, it wouldn't matter because we would look at the original and say, yeah, these guys made mistakes, but we've got the original, but we don't have the original. And we don't have the first copy or the copy of the copy. We don't have copies of the copies of the copies of the copies. What do we have? We have copies that were made many, many years later. That's the problem. Now, moving on to the next problem. The second problem is the problem of variants, multiple variants. A variant is a change in the text. A variant reading is noted while comparing two copies or manuscripts of the New Testament, there's a difference in wording between two manuscripts. So for example, say you're reading John 3:16 and you're comparing how that verse looks in two different manuscripts. And it just so happens that these two manuscripts give us a different word order in the verse, or that there are words missing in one that are contained in the other. That constitutes a variant reading. As Ehrman has already explained, we don't have the original copies or the autographs of the New Testament. What we have are copies many generations removed from the originals. And we know that people are prone to make mistakes while making copies of anything. Therefore, given the many generations of copies standing between our oldest manuscripts and the original publication of these books, it is logical to assume that mistakes are made. Not only so, but we actually know that mistakes were made during the transmission of the text. And it's not like there are just a few mistakes here and there on record. If that were so, there wouldn't be a whole lot to worry about. In fact, many mistakes were made. How many? Well, to get perspective on this, let's first note how many words there are in the New Testament. We'll round up a bit. There are 140,000 words. How many mistakes or variant readings appear in the New Testament manuscripts? Ehrman answers our question. Some scholars will tell you that there are 200,000 differences between the manuscripts. Some will tell you 300,000 differences. Some say 400,000. I don't know. It's something like that. Between 300,000 and 400,000 would be my guess. One thing is certain, even if we go with Ehrman's lower figure of 200,000 variants, one cannot deny that there are more differences between the New Testament manuscripts than there are words in the text itself. So not only does the gap between the autographs and our earliest known copies give us pause, but when we tabulate the overwhelming number of variants within the manuscript tradition, it is unreasonable to believe that what we possess now is what was written in the first century. Now, for our purposes, I'll skip over the issue of the church custodianship for time's sake. But how do we respond to this? When you first hear this, it should feel overwhelming to you. And I know a lot of people who walk away from the faith just by learning this. And I'm not really sure why. When I was a young Christian, I learned very early on that this was just the case. And so it never bothered me. Many of you need to get rid of what James White calls the golden tablet syndrome when it comes to inspiration. Many people believe, I have my King James Bible here, so I can illustrate it with this. Many people believe that the King James just fell into King James's lap and then he signed it and then that was it. But this King James Bible is the result of a long historical process of copying and editing. And so if your view of inspiration just is this idea that the Bible exists as a Platonic form that is eternal and unchanging, then you're going to be rocked by the kinds of things that you just heard. But if you appreciate the fact that even the biblical writers themselves used sources when they wrote their books, Luke tells us, I'm depending on sources as I'm writing this gospel. It shouldn't bother you all that much. Now, I'm not going to be defending the inspiration in the New Testament today, but I am going to be defending the textual integrity of the New Testament, meaning what we have is what was written. So how do I go about doing this? Well, I had the benefit of studying Greek under Dan Wallace. Dan Wallace is a leading textual critic, and he actually founded a Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. For example, you're looking at a manuscript right here. This is the oldest manuscript we have of the New Testament. I was able to go on the website. This is very accessible to any of you. And I would encourage all of you to go on the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, that website, and just look around, type in some things and some wonderful stuff that will show up. You're going to get to look at the history of the text of your Bible, your New Testament, as it developed over time. What I want to do is show you, first of all, a few manuscripts and kind of look at what we're talking about. Now, this John Rylands manuscript, this is called P52, meaning it is a piece of papyrus. It is the size of a credit card. Not all paleographers are in agreement on the dating, but the majority of them all date within the first half of the 2nd century. Now, why is this important? Why was this discovery important? Because in the 19th century, New Testament critics late dated the Gospel of John. Yesterday, when we were laying out the dates for the Gospels, I gave the skeptics the benefit of the doubt, and I said, I think I'm stretching it a lot, but we'll date John at 110. That's the year of our Lord 110, within the first 10 years of the 2nd century. And one of the students came to me afterwards and says, I was really surprised by that because nobody does that. And I was like, yeah, right. Nobody dates John in the 2nd century. But I just did it for the sake of discussion. But In the 19th century, as I just said, a lot of scholars dated John around the year 200. Why? Well, the paradigm in the 19th century was we need to come up with a theory that explains the unity of the New Testament text. The New Testament writers had different understandings of what Christianity was all about. As I've told you before, Ehrman subscribes to what we now call the Bauer-Ehrman thesis, which is the idea that Christianity started out as a diversity. There were in the first century. There wasn't this one thing we called Christianity. And so what happened is the proto-Orthodox later imposed a kind of unity on the earliest documents of the text. So just to give you an example of how this works out, you had a thesis like Peter or James saying that we are saved by works. And then you had an antithesis like Paul saying that we're saved by faith. And then later, John, who comes late in the second century, unifies those guys, puts them together into what he calls the gospel. Now, some of you have studied philosophy may know what I'm talking about. This is Hegel's dialectic. And so they basically just took Hegel's dialectic and imposed it on the New Testament documents. Well, as Dan Wallace used to tell us in my Greek class, an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. This manuscript, which was discovered in the early 20th century, destroyed almost a century's worth of New Testament works on the Gospel of John, because this was dated by C.H. Roberts, who discovered the manuscript at around the year 120, 125, 150 at the latest. Now, why is that significant? Well, first of all, John could not have been written in the year 200. We know that. And second of all, in order for that manuscript to get circulated the way it was, we found it in Egypt. So the way it gets circulated, it had to have a wide circulation to have made its way down to Egypt, and that takes time. And so that's going to put the Gospel of John at the latest in the late first century. So hopefully all of you automatically see why manuscripts are extremely important for understanding not only the history of the New Testament text, but also showing its integrity. Now, there's not a whole lot in John and P52, so we can't build a whole lot on that. But I will scroll down and show you another text. This is the Bodmer Papyri. This collection of papyri, which was dated to around 200, contains our oldest manuscripts of the complete New Testament books, most of the Gospels of John and Luke, and complete copies of Jude, 1 Peter, and 2 Peter. What you're looking at on the left-hand side of the page is a portion of P75, which consists of Luke 16, 9 through 20. The actual size of the papyrus leaf is 10 3/8 by 5 1/8 inches. It has a range of dates between 175 to 225. So we just kind of ballpark it. The textual significance of this witness is hard to overestimate, presenting as it does a form of text very similar to that of Vaticanus. He is not a textual critic, but he is right when he says that these manuscripts contain the earliest complete copies of the New Testament books. This means that within 1 century of the time the New Testament was completed, we have multiple testimonies to the basic teachings, miracles, and resurrection of Christ. Here are the Chester Beatty papyri, P45, P46, P47. Incidentally, the numbers don't refer to their age. It refers to when they were discovered, the order in which they were discovered. So even though P52 is older than this, it was discovered after these were discovered. These were discovered before the Bodmer Papyri. This collection also gives us some of our most precious witnesses to the New Testament. And they are dated between 250 and 300. What you're looking at on the left of this page is a fragment from P45, a codex originally consisting of about 220 leaves, each measuring about 10 by 8 inches, and contains all 4 Gospels and Acts. Why is that important? Well, if we have all 4 Gospels and we have John 1:1 in this collection where it says, Anarche, and halagos, kai halagos, and proston theon, kai theos, and halagos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That means that Jesus is called God 100 years, 125 years before Nicaea. So you can't say that the deity of Jesus was made up by the church fathers at Nicaea. Again, an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. Codex Vaticanus. This is what Metzger and Ehrman, they wrote a book together on the text of the New Testament. This is what they say about Codex Vaticanus. The manuscript was written about the middle of the 4th century and contained both testaments as well as the books of the Apocrypha. For those of you that don't know what the Apocrypha are, these are books written between the testaments. Our Roman Catholic friends will consider all or nearly all of them inspired. Protestants follow the Jewish tradition and do not consider them inspired. However, Christians do consider them, whether they're Catholic or not, as extremely beneficial in helping us understand what happened between Malachi and the birth of Jesus. Today, there are 3 lacunae in the Codex. That means there are holes in the Codex. At the beginning, almost 46 chapters of Genesis are missing. A section of some 30 Psalms is lost, and the concluding pages onward, including 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Revelation, are gone. Now, is that because people threw them out? No, it's just wear and tear on the text. And textual criticism, it's a labor of love, and it's also extremely frustrating. One of the most nightmare stories I ever heard was a textual critic, an archaeologist, found a manuscript in a cave, and he took it outside to put it up to the light to read it, and it withered in his hand. The wind just blew it away, and he was not able to read it and was lost forever. I think he fell on his knees and cried. I think that's what I would have done had that happened to me. Moving on to Codex Sinaiticus. I like to sound fancy, and it is also appropriate to call it Codex Sinaiticus. So if you adopt this, you'll sound smart, even if you don't know what you're talking about. That's right. That's right. And this was made famous because Billy Carson and Wes Huff talked about this, and he called it the Sinai Bible. Now, what's really funny is I have a friend who's a New Testament scholar who wrote me and he says, actually, and he gave me a source where some people do call it the Sinai Bible. So Billy Carson did not make that up. I went on camera and made fun of Billy Carson, and it turns out that I wasn't totally right in what I said. So here's my mea culpa before all of you. We don't know everything, right? This is Codex Sinaiticus. This is the oldest complete copy of the entire New Testament and is dated around the year 340. The Council of Nicaea met in 325, and this was produced within 20 years or so of that. What you're seeing to the left is the 14th and part of the 15th chapter of Mark, which describes Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin. Metzger and Ehrman explain the significance of this. Primacy of position in the list of New Testament manuscripts is customarily given to the 4th century codex of the Greek Bible, discovered about the middle of the 19th century by Constantine von Tischendorf at the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. Hence, this manuscript is called Codex Sinaiticus. It once contained the entire Bible written in a carefully executed magical hand and arranged with 4 columns per page, measuring about 15 by 13.5 inches. Today, parts of the Old Testament have perished, but fortunately, the entire New Testament has survived. Codex Sinaiticus is the only known complete copy of the Greek New Testament in magical script. That's a type of Greek handwriting. So, what should we say about these manuscripts? And I could actually give you a lot more. What should we say about the preservation of the New Testament? Why are there so many variants in the New Testament manuscript tradition? To give you perspective, if you have no variants in your manuscript tradition, there's a really good reason for that. Can y'all guess? Yeah, you have one copy. And sometimes that's all we have of an ancient source. So imagine you had a copy of an ancient Roman historian and it's just one copy. And the historian wrote in the 1st century, but the copy is dated to around the year 1000. How confident are you that we actually have what he wrote? You can't be all that confident. You can't brag about the fact that there are no variants because there are no other copies. The reason we have so many variants in the New Testament manuscript tradition is because we have so many manuscripts. How many manuscripts do we have? We're not really sure. The current counting is 5,800. It's 5,800 and counting. One of the problems with the counting is some people double count. And that's one of the reasons we don't know. So the low end of this is 5,700. The high end is like 5,900. So I'm ballparking at 5,800. If we add up many of the manuscripts of the classical age of classical literature, at least of the works of Homer, the Iliad, his history, Sophocles, his plays, Plato, Caesar, his Gallic Wars, Livy, the history of Rome, Tacitus, his Annals of Rome, Pliny the Elder, his natural history, and Thucydides, his history, and Demosthenes, his speeches. If we add all of these up together, we get 4,100 manuscripts. So what does that mean about the New Testament? We have more manuscripts from the New Testament alone than all of these classical works combined. My point is strengthened if we look at the worst or least preserved text in the New Testament tradition. What is our worst? It's Revelation. How many manuscripts do we have of the book of Revelation? We have 300. And yet this book outnumbers every other work we just mentioned, with the exception of Homer, Livy, and Demosthenes. In other words, we have more copies just of the book of Revelation than all of those classical authors, save 3. It alone outnumbers several of these classic works combined, and compared with the 3 that outnumber it, we have good reason to trust it. Demosthenes wrote around the year 350 BC, while our earliest surviving copy of his work is around 50 BC. There's a 300-year gap between the work and the earliest copy. Now, this is one of the most important things that the textual critics look at. What is the gap between when the work was written and our earliest copy of the work? With Demosthenes, there's a 300-year gap between the work and the copy. Livy wrote in the 1st century BC, while our earliest surviving copy of his work is around AD 350. That gives us a 300-year gap. Homer wrote around 800 BC, while earliest surviving copy of his work is around 400 BC. So there's a 400-year gap. Revelation was written around the year 100, while, as we have seen, P47, which contains that book, is dated at 250 at the latest. So there's a 150-year gap between Revelation and its earliest copy. So it beats these other manuscripts. This manuscript of Revelation is partially mutilated, and yet worse can be said of the other works. The earliest manuscripts of these 3 classical works are all mere fragments. Much of the Apocalypse is contained in the Chester Beatty Papyri, and by 340 we have a full copy of Revelation contained in Codex Sinaiticus. There are 9,667 Greek words in the book of Revelation, wherein about 130 words are in question. In other words, there's a 98.7% agreement between these manuscripts. Now, why is that important? Because these manuscripts are literally found everywhere. They're all over the Middle East. They're in other places. They're in Rome. They're in the 7 cities that the book of Revelation was sent to, like Philadelphia. They're in Egypt. They're all over the place. And the reason this 98% agreement is important is because you know that these guys couldn't have gotten together to collude to create the text. So the agreement between these copyists, or these copies, speaks to the preservation of the book of Revelation. To get a feel for how our New Testament manuscript tradition compares with the average classical writer from antiquity, here's a visual aid. The average classical writer gives us 4 feet of information. The World Trade Center is 92 feet. The New Testament is a mile high. So just get that picture in your head. Our manuscripts are taller than the World Trade Center. Well, this is the new one. Yeah. So here's the comparison. You have the work, the date of production, the earliest surviving manuscripts, and then the number of surviving manuscripts. This all speaks for itself. Homer, 800, that's when it was produced. 400 BC is when it was copied, or our earliest copy. We have 2,200 plus manuscripts. Some of you might be familiar with Josh McDowell and his material, and you remember the number of 643. Well, McDowell and his son actually updated all the numbers, and so we found a couple of manuscripts of the Iliad. So there's been an increase in those numbers too. So there's 2,200. The Iliad is second place in the ancient world. New Testament is 5,800, Iliad is 2,200. Herodotus' history, written around 425 BC, earliest copy 150 to 50 BC, and we have about 106 of those. Notice how the numbers just start going down. 106, we have 226, 238, 251, 473. We have 36 copies of Tacitus. We have 200 copies of Pliny's Natural History, 188. So the total is just under 4,100. The New Testament, 5,856 manuscripts, thereabouts. When you count the translations, we have just under 24,000 manuscripts. It's an embarrassment of riches. The other thing that we have are quotations of the New Testament from the early church fathers. So when we are asking a question about the reading of the text, we will sometimes go to the church fathers and we'll notice that this father gave witness to this reading. How many quotations of the church fathers do we have? We're not really sure, but Ehrman and Metzger point out that you can reconstruct most of the New Testament just from the church fathers' quotes alone. There is an apocryphal tale that's going around, and I used to give this in apologetics talks, and here's another mea culpa on my part. I'm correcting myself. There's this tale that says that if you count up all the quotes of the church fathers, it's the entire New Testament with the exception of 11 verses. That is apocryphal. That is not true. Okay. There was an essay that was written a few years ago that exposed that, and he was calling on people not to overestimate what we have from the church fathers. But it is significant that we do have a lot of quotations from the church fathers. Okay. Yes. It can be found in a book called 10 Myths on Textual Criticism. And the editor's name has slipped my mind. I almost brought the book in, but it's the essay contained in that book. Okay. How we doing? Any questions about this before I take another step? Variants. We've talked about 200,000 variants between these manuscripts. Are they significant? That's the question. Ehrman himself has said that the differences between the New Testament manuscripts are insignificant. They amount to spelling errors. They amount to a missing letter. So here's an example. What if you're looking at one manuscript and it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life." And you looked at another manuscript and it says, "God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life." You say, what's the difference? Well, one had the word "for," and one was missing the word "for." That's a variant. Well, monogenes can be translated only begotten or unique or one and only. However you want to translate monogenes, the point is, if monogenes was spelled differently in one manuscript than the other, like you're missing an O, an omicron, right? You're missing that means you have a variant. So what did the variants really amount to? Of those 200,000 variants, about 3% are what we call meaningful and viable. In fact, of that 3%, only about 1% are meaningful. Now, what is viable? Viable means it has a good chance of being a legitimate reading of the text. However, even if you accepted the reading, you wouldn't really change your interpretation of the text all that much. Or if you did, it really wouldn't affect anything with respect to Christian doctrine. Not a single doctrine of the Christian faith is affected by these variants. And I'd like to give you an example. Okay, so what am I looking at? What are we looking at? We're looking at the book of Romans. Can y'all see my pointer? Do you see my pointer? That very first sentence, you read along and see that word here. Do you see my pointer? That's a common. Okay. So what Paul is saying is, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. That word, a common, has a variant, and you can go down here and you'll see that right there. Notice it's spelled a little differently. That looks like a W. That's called an omega. So is it a common or a common? That's a variant. If it's spelled a common, Paul is saying, therefore, having been justified by faith, let us have peace with God. Or he's saying, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. Now, I want to ask all of you this. Are you about to abandon the faith because we're not 100% sure if it's a common or a common? In both texts, Paul is telling us we have been justified by faith. And he's either saying that because we've been justified by faith, we have peace with God, or he's saying, now that we've been justified by faith, let us pursue peace with God. Now, are there any other places in the New Testament where Paul actually exhorts people to pursue peace with God? Well, you find it in different places. He says it in 2 Corinthians 5, be reconciled to God. He's calling on people to pursue peace with God. So this would not affect Paul's doctrine at all. Now, I personally believe that it's a common and not a common, but I would not lose my faith over, if Bart Ehrman walked in here and twisted my arm, he wrestled me to the ground intellectually and said, no, dude, it's a common, not a common. I would say, okay, it says, let us pursue peace with God instead of we have peace with God. That is what we're talking about with these variants. Do I believe with 100% certainty that we possess the New Testament as it was written in the first century? Yes. Do I believe with 100% certainty that the text here in the text proper gives us the right reading of the original New Testament text? No. Where is the original New Testament text? If I pick up my Greek New Testament and I look at the text, the original reading is either going to be here in the text proper or in the footnotes. But I know with certainty that what I possess is the New Testament of the first century. That I know for sure. What I can't know for sure is whether all the text critics who made a judgment on it got it right, or did the true reading get relegated to the footnotes? Okay. It is about 3:30, and I know this could be a provocative topic, so I wanted to give about 10 or 15 minutes for you guys ask questions on this topic. So I'm now going to open up for the floor for you to ask a question. Some of you may know about this topic and you don't think that I've clarified things well enough. So if I need to make a clarifying statement, please ask. Yes. I don't know how many are of the Quran. I will tell you this. The reason we don't know of how many are in the Quran, at least going back to the original, is because the Quran came about in several stages. The Quran means recitation, and it was originally just recited by the followers of Muhammad. And then there was a famous battle, and all of you will remember this after today, the Battle of Yamama. And at the Battle of Yamama, a lot of the people that had memorized the Quran died. And so they had a crisis. And so they called everyone who had memorized the Quran together to produce the Quran, and they wrote it down. 114 surahs. Chapters, surahs. They went about their way. But then a new caliph came along and realized that there were so many differences between these Qurans that he said, we need to come up with a standard authorized version of the Quran. And so they were called to Mecca. The scholars got together. They rescinded the Quran and they gave us the official Quran. And then they took all of the variant readings of the Quran and they put it in a warehouse for safekeeping, right? No, they burned them. I want to repeat that. They burned them. I have to say that one more time. They burned them. So do I know that I'm holding the Quran that was originally produced? No. That's why you actually have a dispute between Sunni Muslims who say the Quran is my standard, it's my authority. I'm not holding a Quran, by the way, I'm holding a New Testament. But the Quran is my standard, it's my authority. And you have Shiites who say, no, the Sunnis corrupted the Quran, and that's why their imam takes on a kind of prophetic function in their authority. The imam is a prophet who receives revelation from Allah to supplement the flaws in the Quran. Buddha died in 480 BC. The first time his story was written down, this is amazing, about the year 100, so almost 600 years after Buddha died, we have his story being written down for the first time. Yesterday, I demonstrated that Paul received a creed and delivered it to the Corinthians, and he actually received that creed within 5 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. So that within 5 years, the Christians had a well thought out creed speaking of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. That is a creedal formula. The earliest trustworthy manuscripts we have of Buddhist literature, 18th century. That's a huge gap. Do I believe that we pretty much have the story of Buddha as the tradition wants us to have it? But if I say the New Testament isn't trustworthy in its preservation, I have to throw out all the classical writers, I have to throw out all the Buddhist literature, I have to throw all that stuff out. Now, there's some postmodernists in our day who would love that. But I don't know. I think knowing ancient history is a good idea, and I think we should keep that literature. Sure. Yeah. What I've said today demonstrates that what we have is what was written. I've neither shown that it's historically accurate, nor have I shown that it's inspired. You can make a strong case that it's historically accurate just from here. So you show that we have what was written, and then you show that we can trust these writers. And then once you show that it's historically accurate, then you can demonstrate that it's inspired, but it would be on top of that. So it would be a layered case for inspiration. Now, I have a quote in this essay where Ehrman says that if he and Metzger were put in a library, Bruce Metzger was the greatest textual critic of the last part of the 20th century, and he was a mentor for Bart Ehrman, and Bruce Metzger was a Christian. Some of you may have heard that name. He was interviewed in Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ. So for those of you that read The Case for Christ, you got an interview of him in there. And Ehrman says, if you put us in a room together, we hammered out what we thought the New Testament was, there would only be a difference between us of a handful of verses. So I think Ehrman knows that we have what was written. What he's really arguing is inspiration. He's saying we have the New Testament as it was written. He doesn't think it's historically reliable, but why would God not give us or let us keep the autographs? Now, any answer I give to you is going to be speculative. So I'm not going to speculate, but I'm like, okay, you have to believe certain other things before you're going to buy into inspiration. And so what I would do is I would make a case for Jesus' resurrection on the reliability of the text. Why do I think the New Testament is inspired if Jesus rose from the dead? Because Jesus said it is. Where did Jesus say that the New Testament is inspired? Matthew 23. He said to his enemies, I'm sending you prophets and apostles and scribes. Prophets, apostles are sent, prophets receive revelation, and scribes write it down. So he was telling his enemies, I'm going to deliver to you a new scripture. And this is the fulfillment of that prophecy. So my case for Christianity is very simple. God raised Jesus from the dead. Therefore, he approves of whatever Jesus says. Jesus says, I am the Son of God. Therefore, he is. And the Son of God says, this is inspired. So that's my case for inspiration. Anybody else? Yes. Sure. Do the events recorded in the histories of the timeline of the New Testament? I think they do. I think you make a strong case. Skeptics will push back on one or two incidents. For example, skeptics will say that Luke got it wrong on Quirinius, the census under Quirinius. Now, in this course, we're going to be studying that in detail, and I'm going to try to give an answer to that. But really, if you get Colin Heemer's book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, he will comb through the book of Acts and show that place after place after place has been vindicated that Luke talks about in archaeology. So archaeology has done a whole lot to vindicate the various claims of the New Testament. I quoted Suetonius, who spoke of the expulsion of the Jews from Rome. And you pick up the book of Acts and you read Acts 18, verse 2, and it says Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. So you have that kind of cross-referencing, that vindication going on all over the place in the ancient histories and the New Testament where they meet together. You have a follow-up question? Sure. How would Matthew and Luke know Jesus experienced this temptation? You have several options. One, Jesus may have told them. After the resurrection, he appeared to them over a period of 40 days, and he could have told them some of the things that were going on behind the scenes. Or, he was with them, I believe, for 3.5 years. And so he may have told them about this encounter with Satan even before he died. I don't have any doubt that Jesus told them all kinds of things that were going on. So either before or after his resurrection, yes. Which has nothing to do with the New Testament. Sure.
Yes,
Sure. It's really good that you asked that question. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's the question. The Dead Sea Scrolls are now our most precious manuscripts in terms of bridging the gap between when the Old Testament was completed and the earliest copies. We had the earliest copies of the Old Testament being dated around the 900s, the 10th century AD. But the Bible was completed 400 BC, so that's a big gap. The Dead Sea Scrolls cut that gap in half. Great Scroll of Isaiah, which is one of the scrolls of Isaiah that we have, we think it was produced around the year 200 BC, maybe 150 BC. When all is said and done, there's a 3-letter difference between the greater scroll of Isaiah, the Qumran scroll, and the Masoretic text. It's the Hebrew word or, Aleph, Vav, and Resh. It's found in Isaiah 53. It's a 3-letter difference. The Dead Sea Scrolls has it. The Masoretic text does not. Now, if you want a more detailed discussion, Wes Huff just had Joseph Mead on his show, and they talk about the Isaiah scroll. And there are technically more differences, but they explain to you why what I just said is not false, but there's a whole lot more to the story. The Dead Sea Scrolls did experience significant corruption. We wouldn't call that a variant reading of the text. It just was corrupted at the bottom. In fact, Mead points out that we actually know why it was corrupted, where it was corrupted, because the scroll was put on the same rack every day, and the bottom strip, at very certain points, has holes in it. And so we know why the corruption existed. So it's a really interesting interview if you want to read that or listen to that. No, are you talking about the issue of canon? How did we put these books together? We believe that, for example, Paul's letters were circulated as a collection of letters very early. And one of the reasons we believe that is in 2 Peter, regardless of when you date the book, he speaks of a collection of Paul's letters and he equates them with scripture. So it's not that they were just haphazardly found together in a pile. They were together because someone early on in the tradition thought it was important to collect these. By the middle of the 2nd century, Christians became what we call canon conscious. They began to realize we need to separate the books that we hold sacred from those that we don't hold sacred. And so by 180, we actually have a Muratorian fragment, which gives us almost all the books of the New Testament the Christians considered as canonical. And by the 4th century, we have a complete canon list where Eusebius divides the books between the undisputed books, the disputed books, and then those books that are rejected. All of the disputed books were eventually put into our canon. So when you hear people say, well, it's just a bunch of guys in a smoke-filled room, willy-nilly choosing which books. No, these were books that were widely used in the churches. They're not going to choose a book that's not widely used. The Bible really was put together by just common people. Obviously, they were elite in the sense that they could read and write, and that wasn't common in the ancient world. These were not elitists who held things in abeyance from the people. This was a product of common people in the church, read to Christians in the church, and developed as such. And that's why you have these differences between the manuscripts and all of that. Anybody else? Yeah. Well, P52 and also the Chester-Beatty Papyri and the Bodmer Papyri. And all of those books, I just gave John 1:1, but they're all speaking of the deity of Christ before Nicaea. Yes. And this will be the last question. There are two issues going on here. One is an historical issue as to when the doctrine of the deity of Christ was developed. And so the argument is, after Nicaea, people changed the text to make Jesus look like God. That is refuted by this manuscript evidence. The other issue is a translation issue. And the Jehovah's Witnesses are arguing that the missing definite article in the third clause of John 1:1 proves that we should translate it, and the word was a God. But that's not a manuscript tradition issue. That's a translation issue. Now, some of you might say, well, how do you answer that? Well, we're going to spend a lot of time in the prologue to John's Gospel in this course, so I will hold that off until we get there. But I assure all of you, the grammar very clearly tells us that Jesus is God. Some people that have studied Greek, or anybody in here that studied Greek, well, I can say that without any fear of contradiction from a Greek scholar.